Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our professional development webinar series for parish and diocesan ministers. Thank you for joining us for a presentation titled The Spirituality of Administration, Turning Mundane Tasks into Redeeming Work. My name is Jared Dees. I'm the Digital Publishing Specialist at Ave Maria Press, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is brought to you exclusively by Ave Maria Press in partnership with the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. Everyone in the audience is muted today, and you are also not on webcam, but you're able to ask questions, and questions may be sent to our presenter using the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel, which you can see displayed here. So please take a moment now to find that box for typing questions in your GoToWebinar panel, and simply click the Send button at the bottom right-hand corner to send your questions to our presenter, and I'll read as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation today. I'd also like to note this webinar is being recorded. However, the webcam version will only be seen in the live by live attendees. And if you're watching this as a recording, I'm sorry you can't see our faces. And we'll send a recording out to you later this week, so check your inboxes, email inboxes for that recording. So with that, I would like to welcome Anne Garrido. Anne is the Associate Professor of Homiletics and the Director of the Masters of Arts in Pastoral Studies program at Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis. A lay Catholic woman, she holds a Master of Divinity and a doctorate in Ministry and Preaching. She also serves as the Senior Editor for Human Development. And Anne is the author of the new book, Redeeming Administration, which will be the focus of her presentation today. So Anne, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Jared.
Great. Well, I'm going to hand over controls to you.
Okay.
So you can pull up your presentation.
Okay.
Here you go.
Great. So let me hit Does that look okay?
Looks good. You're good to go.
Okay, great. Well, first off, let me just say what a tremendous honor and privilege it is for me to get to be with you this afternoon, because I know how much experience and fidelity and wisdom is present here among all the people on this call. And I feel very personally humbled to think that I've been invited to say anything to you whatsoever. My journey in ministry, I suspect, has been very similar to your own. I started out after college teaching in the CCD program at my parish. I ended up working as a middle school and high school teacher in a Catholic school for a number of years. And until I got kind of tapped or drawn into administration. And it's nothing that I really had planned on as a career path per se. I tried to think back like, well, when did this happen? How did this end up in my life going this direction? And I think one day I was at graduate school here at Aquinas, and one of our traditions as a school is that the faculty and staff and students all sit down and eat lunch with each other every day. And the president and I were sitting and having lunch when I was, I think, a doctoral student, and we were talking about a theologian who maybe had caused a little bit of controversy in the church and had been removed from his teaching position. And I said to our president, I said, like, well, what is he doing now that he's been freed from teaching? And he said, well, I think he's been released. He's in his room probably writing more. And I said, well, if they really wanted to stop him, they would assign him 6 sections of freshman theology to teach. And he just kind of paused for a moment, and he looked at me, and he said, you have the wicked mind of an administrator. And I think that probably is how it came to pass. Shortly thereafter, I began working in administration at Aquinas, and I've been in various administrative roles in the school now for, this is my 14th year at the school. One of the very first jobs that I ever had in administration was the field ed director. And I know many of you in your parish settings probably at some point in time or another have had maybe a seminarian or a lay ministry student who have been sent to you for mentoring to kind of learn out in the field. So at Aquinas, I would have been the one who sent that person to you. And the belief underneath that is that there's certain things you can learn in the classroom, but really there are certain things you can really only learn in the field. And the best way of teaching them is to send students out into the field, but then have them come back and reflect on their experiences, something that we call theological reflection, where they sit and ask, what is it that I learned? How am I being shaped by my experience out in the field? And as a field director, I many times told students, you will have both pleasant and unpleasant experiences, but whether or not they're good or bad experiences depends on how you interpret them, depends on whether you learn anything from them, depends on the person that you choose to become as a result of having gone through these experiences. And I think about maybe 6 or 7 years into my job, I began to realize that I was teaching students to do this kind of theological reflection on their ministry. But did I ever stop and actually do theological reflection on mine? And if I thought about the administrative component of my job, which is by and far the largest part of what I was doing in my day, was I learning anything from it? How was I growing from it? And I realized that I had become quite the whirling dervish of activity, and was very tiring and very dizzying to me. And had I stopped to ask myself the question of what kind of person was I becoming as a result of this, was I as conscientious about my placement and what I was learning there as I was asking students to be in theirs, kind of what was the effect of this work on me? Was I becoming actually a better person? And what kind of person did I want to be out of doing this kind of work? And the first thing that I recognized when I began to ask myself these sorts of questions was that administrative work in my mind was only loosely connected to ministry. As Jared mentioned, I had finished my MDiv. I had been trained to be a minister, but most of what I was doing with my day was actually emailing and scheduling and calendaring and supervising and a lot of computer work. And it didn't seem to relate very much to what I had imagined that ministry was going to look like for myself when I was doing my MDiv. And I think that some of my own maybe a little bit of disheartenment with that experience in ministry has some very deep roots in our tradition. And that was where my own theological reflection on the subject began to take me. I think it's evident in some of the earliest passages from our tradition. I'm going to read something from the book of the first letter of Corinthians from Paul. And it's one of the earliest passages from Scripture that's been written. It's also one of the really rare places in Scripture where administration actually appears. So Paul says, now you are the body of Christ and individually parts of it. And some people God has designated in the church to be first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, and then mighty deeds, then gifts of healing, assistance, administration, and varieties of tongues. Are all apostles, are all prophets, are all teachers, do all do mighty deeds, do all have the gift of healing, do all speak in tongues, do all interpret, strive eagerly for the greatest spiritual gifts. Now when I looked at this passage, one of the things that really intrigued me that I noted about the passage is where administrators fall on the list. Now, I would say Paul is arguing that every different kind of ministry is absolutely critical for the upbuilding of the body of Christ, and he's not trying to say that one is more important than the other. He's saying that all of them are valuable, but I do think it's kind of interesting that administration comes just right above speaking in tongues, and then that when Paul goes back the second time, he goes through and mentions all these different ministries over again, but he just forgets administration from his list. And I think in history, the church has oftentimes persisted in that kind of forgetfulness that Paul exhibits here in this passage from 1 Corinthians. If I go over to the Divinity Library, which is just a few blocks from me now on campus, St. Louis University has an amazing divinity library, 4 stories high of just books, all for the field of theology. The spirituality of teaching, about how each of these kind of different functions in the Christian community can be a place of real holiness, a place to grow in holiness. But if you tried to look on the library shelf for anything about administration as a path to holiness, you'd have pretty slim pickings. And even if you look at the Catholic liturgical calendar, it's filled with all different kinds of saints, martyrs and beloved teachers and nurses and eccentrics and preachers, founders, but very, very few administrators. And I began to realize in this kind of ongoing theological reflection that I was doing that administration oftentimes has been disdained, both within the ministry itself and without. So those of us who work in the ministry of administration oftentimes consider the administrative tasks that we have to undertake to be kind of odious. They take us away from what we would say we would most like to be doing, that most drew us into ministry in the first place: the preaching, the teaching, the sitting at the bedside, maybe the hanging out with the teenagers or getting to visit the elderly. And from the outside, administration oftentimes is considered to be kind of an oppressive force, something to be feared or spoken about in hushed tones of suspicion around that coffee machine in the morning. And I think that both those of us who are in administration and then those who are outside thinking about administration speak about the role of administration in the church with a certain kind of reservation, as if it might result in kind of a spiritual tainting of some sort. And it kind of reminds me of when I was a child growing up in the church, that we would learn the prayer called the act of contrition, and we would promise not only to avoid sin, but all of the near occasions of sin. And it seems as if so much of what I do in my daily task as an administrator almost fits that bill of near occasion of sin, of being in a zone where there's a lot of things that tempt us. In administration, one is given a lot of power. One is given stewardship of money and resources. One has to execute almost continuous judgment. And these are all things in which Jesus in the Gospels kind of sows suspicion about, almost to the point where if you look at Christian hagiography, the stories of the saints, they're almost consistently, whenever anybody is chosen as a leader or as an administrator in a story of a saint, the person tries to escape until the people bring you back against your will. And it's no wonder that so many of us have mixed feelings about working in administration. But one of the things that I began to recognize was that while I have been trained to avoid temptation, and we want to acknowledge that, there's also a part of our Catholic tradition that acknowledges that these things we call near occasions of sin are also occasions where virtue can be practiced in a most particular way, in quite an intentional way. And that near occasions of sin are also those places where we can be forced to take a stand, to make decisions, to define ourselves. And in short, it's in near occasions of sin are also near occasions of grace. That these are places where we can really be fashioned into a saintly, a holy people. So what if we began to reconceive administration to challenge the kind of poor reputation that administration has developed in the history of our tradition as something that sucks the life and the light out of good people, and instead thought about it as a potential spiritual pathway by which good people can become even better people, distinguished by a certain kind of translucence and aliveness that extends beyond themselves and into the institutions that they serve. So in theological language, what I'm talking about is, could administration be construed as a praxis, an activity that has the potential to transform not only the lives of others, not only to help our institutions to flourish, but to transform oneself in the process also. How can administration be a spiritual journey? I think there's lots of ways of defining spirituality. One possible way of defining spirituality is to say that it is the particular way in which God works out our salvation in the world. So in essence, the particular way that God brings us to the fullness of life and light for which we are intended. So if I talk about then a Christian spirituality, that what I'm talking about is, I mean, Jesus Christ plays an absolutely integral, central role in our salvation. If I talk about a marital spirituality, it means that somehow it's in the experience of being married that God is forming me into the kind of person that God dreams me to be. If I talk about a ministerial spirituality, it means somehow in the doing of ministry, if we pause to reflect on how, through the practice of ministry, God is transforming the minister. And then if we talk about a spirituality of administration, the title for today's talk, what I mean by that is, how is the daily stuff of administration somehow part of the way that God is transforming me into being the person that God dreams me to be?
Anna, I'm sorry to interrupt real quickly.
Sure.
Can you, I think we might have your screen frozen. I took away the video feed or your webcam feed for now, and we can bring it back up for the Q&A part. But can you unplay, or I guess come out of the presentation and open it back up again, and I think it'll get to the right slide.
Sure.
Okay.
So I haven't moved a slide yet.
Oh, okay. Some people were coming in and wondering. I wasn't sure if
my
I was
slideshow is not as dazzling.
This is perfect. So people were asking.
So I'm going to go
ahead
and move one in the very future.
And just so everybody knows,
we'll
bring the webcam back up during the Q&A part. Just want to make sure that the internet connection stays strong and that we can hear the audio perfectly. So.
Oh, okay. That sounds good. Thanks, Jared.
Yep.
Yeah. So while I recognize that every single administrator's journey is kind of particular and unique, I think when we think about what is the daily stuff of administration and how might that actually make something more out of us, actually transform us or change us, what I began to do is I interviewed a large number of administrators and asked, over the course of your work in administration, how are you being changed? How are you actually being transformed? And are there certain ways in which you think that being in administration is helping you to become a better person? Now, one of the things that they pointed out to me on a regular basis was that just simply sitting at my desk at my computer is not simply going to transform me. There's this element of choice, like what am I going to do with the tasks that I've been given? How am I going to respond to the different experiences that come my way as an administrator? But it is to say that if we're attentive to that kind of potential grace that's in our day-to-day responsibilities that we engage as an administrator, that we can actually be molded and shaped in profound ways. So the key is to be aware of and open to that invitation that each day at the desk presents. And what I talk about in the book is 12 invitations that I think regularly come the way of administrators. For the sake of time this afternoon, I'm just going to go with like 4, maybe even 3, because I know that there's so much that could be covered in 1 hour. But what I want to emphasize about the virtues that I'm going to bring up is that I'm not trying to add anything to your schedule at all, because I am sure that it is already very, very full. So I'm not suggesting increased time for prayer or for a retreat, even though I know these would be very, very, very welcome. But what I want to try to do is to highlight the spiritual possibilities that are already laid in what you're doing. So here, for sake of visual, let me change Oh, see, you're right. I should have changed my screen a lot earlier. Here's the definition of spirituality that I meant to put up earlier. This will be good for when we talk about humility. That spirituality being the particular way God works out our salvation in this world. And then this is the first invitation that I want to talk about administration calling us to. So some jobs that we have invite us to do just one thing and to do it really well. And we're only responsible for our own piece of the puzzle, and we don't need to worry about the rest of the pieces of the puzzle because that's somebody else's job. And oftentimes we don't know who that somebody else is that's going to take care of the rest. We only know that it should be done, that it needs to be done. And what many people fail to recognize is that that mysterious someone else stitching together the space that's left between everyone else's job description is usually the administrator. And administrators, like kids, are those who know, the darndest things. Know where the copy machine repair company number is kept, where all the paper clips are, who's on vacation. I remember one day particularly running behind the alley of our school with a plunger in my hand and thinking, this surely cannot be what I did all of this studying for. But there's a gift side to knowing the intricacies of the buildings in which we work and how they work and how the whole staff works together, is that administrators possess, more than most people, I think, a vision of the whole of the organization. So really an understanding of how all of the parts fit together and work in relationship to one another. And rather than being able to see only from one department's viewpoint, they grasp the interplay of all the different perspectives and appreciate how they harmonize or compete. So they see how the action of one would impact the other. And in this way, administration really stretches the intellectual capacities of those who hold positions in this field, helping them to illumine the dynamics between the components of institutional life that other people would miss. And that's a different sort of intelligence than ministry school ever really prepared us for, but it's a very valuable intelligence nonetheless. And my experience has been that over time, that kind of constant expanding of the mind also expands the heart, so that one begins to really love and desire the common good, the flourishing of all. And the breadth of vision that administration fosters in us can really lead to a wideness of spirit. In Latin, the term for that is magnanimity, in which administrators learn to sublimate even their own agendas and aspirations to what would best serve the good of the whole. And administration, I think, over time kind of moves us beyond pettiness, beyond fixation on details, toward that kind of big picture. And I think to the degree that we as administrators are able to hold and carry the big picture of our organization, we begin to participate in some way in the mystery of God, who holds, and carries the biggest picture of all, that we get to share in something of God's grandness of vision and grandness of spirit, and become, like what the prophets are referred to in the Hebrew scriptures, friends of God. We begin to empathize with God about the challenges that God faces in a particular way. We begin to understand better than most why things are the way they are, to know that there's always more to the story than what everybody else thinks, and begin to sympathize, kind of like that Jim Carrey movie, I'm forgetting the title of it right now, but where he has to take Bruce Almighty, where he began to sympathize with all the different voices that will be ringing out and crying to God in need, and we begin to empathize with what God's position is in the universe. And in response to that also, we also then begin to draw inspiration and consolation and guidance from God who sees and loves the whole. I think the image of God that I have as divine administrator often resonates with the stories of creation in Scripture, the very first 2 chapters of Genesis, which, as we know in the Bible, there's actually 2 stories of creation. And in the first one, everything flows out in this most very well organized manner. You know, in due order, light is separated from darkness, and then the water from the dry land, and then the plants from the from the sea, and the animals, and then very carefully, step by step by step, God is preparing the world for the arrival of humanity, so that when the first humans step out into the scene on day 6, everything they need and more has been put into place for their arrival. The second account of creation paints a very different picture, where God creates the human first and then suddenly realizes, like, oh, this guy's going to need some place to live. After fashioning the garden and many animal companions, God wakes up to the fact, this isn't quite working. You know, my human creature is lonely. And then the being that was 1 becomes 2. Now, I oftentimes fancy myself in the image of God in the first story. I would like to think that when I carefully unroll my new program, it's going to happen in this orderly, step-by-step process in which everything proceeds smoothly. And in reality, my experience of administration looks a lot more like the second account, kind of like, oh, you know, welcome to the staff. You're going to need an office. Oh, you're going to need an email account and a telephone. But whichever one I think that we draw our own inspiration and counsel from, we recognize that what both of these images share in common is that a creator who takes great care in establishing an environment in which life can really blossom. And God's primary work is to set a stage, to give space, to create conditions in which a diversity of creatures can flourish. The God of Genesis is intimately involved in this space. Indeed, in that second account, you know, God likes to go walking through the garden at the breezy time of day. But one doesn't get the sense that God is micromanaging, that God creates a place where humans are free to roam and discover with very few prohibitions. And when humanity violates that, you know, the one great prohibition, God doesn't step in and try to fix everything. God sews the humans some clothes, again, remaining intimately involved with them, but leaves them to work out the consequences of their actions. And I've often thought that this is a great image for the spiritual journey of the administrator, that really the primary task of the administrator involves creating an environment in which life can flourish, and attention to that environment for us really is a holy work, because it has to do with establishing and maintaining the kind of order that's necessary for human freedom and creativity to function unimpeded. And I know that sounds really simplistic, but if the copy machine is working and the stapler has staples and people know where to turn to show up for the first day of CCD class or RE, and they know where RCIA is meeting, if people know where to turn if they have a concern, if they know the protocol for when there's a conflict, then that kind of organization becomes the place where good work can naturally happen. And the function of the administrator isn't to micromanage every single interaction, not get intimately wrapped up in every problem, but to support people in the environment to work through their issues on their own as much as possible. And in that way, administration becomes a really creative exercise, the kind of place where I can continuously tinker and practice a hidden sort of care that's oftentimes very behind the scenes. I think the hiddenness of much of what we do in administration really can be a challenge to us. And at one point in the book, I write about how administration cultivates agape, that capacity to continue to love even when no one even knows the work that we're doing for them, that no one ever says, oh, thanks so much for making sure that we have adequate staplers. What they always do is all you hear is when things are not going right in the environment, and you don't hear when things are going right in the environment. So that takes a kind of perseverance and inner strength that I think administration cultivates within us as well, a capacity for agape and loving people who never even know all of the things that you're doing behind the scenes. A second practice that I think administration invites us to is the next one I've put up on the screen. When I've traveled around the country and I've asked a lot of different administrators, what is it that your work has most taught you over time? By far, the most common response that I get from administrators after a long moment of pause is the word trust. And the number of times in which I've heard that response has begun to make me kind of laugh because I wonder whether possibly as a group we are not a particularly trusting people. Like those with a proclivity for administration are not very naturally trusting. And I think primarily that laughter is directed toward me. The draw toward administration in my case, for my personality set, is that I do have a deep love of order and a desire to see things get done right. I like to see processes that flow smoothly and that work like clockwork. And deep down inside, I think I harbor a belief that the very best chance of that happening is if I am intimately involved and controlling all of the details. And after 13 years, my job has almost beat that out of me. Not quite, but almost. And many days, my office resembles like a 3-ring circus on math. I always crack up at that bumper sticker that I see on the back of cars that says, you know, I try to take one day at a time, but some days, several days attacked me at once. And administration has placed me in situations that are so much larger than what I am able to handle on my own, that in doing so, administration has forced me to finally let go of the illusion that I can micromanage everything. And it's taught me how to trust other people to carry out their part. I think for myself in the beginning that is particularly tough. It's hard for me to trust other people with important jobs for them to do on their own in the way that they see fit, because I think, you know, wouldn't it be good if I could just observe her a little bit longer? What if he does something that offends the congregation and fails, and then I need to go in and pick up all the pieces, and that's going to take even more time than if I had just done it myself. I think it's especially hard to turn over to other people those parts of our ministry that we feel particularly competent in or that we enjoy doing the most ourselves, and allow someone else to do it differently, to structure it differently than the way I would structure it, to allow the possibility that something might go awry. But then eventually what I think administration has really taught me is that God has been gracious in abundantly distributing gifts throughout the human race, not merely among administrators, and that others cannot gain this kind of needed experience in their positions if I insist on doing all of the work for them. And that furthermore, the work will actually be more successful because they have gifts that I do not have. And that it will endure when others are able to share their contributions and collaborate rather than me doing it all. As a complement to that, I think administration also teaches us over time to trust ourselves, to trust our intuition, to not, it used to be when I first started, everything had to be uber prepared. I needed to figure out answers to questions that weren't even going to be asked. And now I think with time I feel more confident winging it. I feel more comfortable that I can be flexible in the moment, trust my gut response. But a third way that administration, I think, has taught me trust, and a lot of people I've heard talk to me about this, is that administration very slowly has taught me to trust the value of the ministry of administration itself. That while we might go into administration hoping to make a difference, to set an institution on a new course, to offer clear direction, we find that so much of administration is about sustaining, keeping what already exists going, or in common lingo, paper pushing. And many days, I know I have sworn that as soon as I clear off my desk, I will think a great new thought. But as soon as I clear off the desk, more material keeps coming in. I delete 3 emails, and then by the time that I answer those, 4 more have arrived, and the day goes by, and I marvel at the end of the day that I even bother to get paid because I do not seem to have accomplished anything whatsoever. And I keep trying to bring the order out of the chaos, and it keeps bobbing up again like some kind of carnival game. And you wonder, does anything I do ever make a difference? And there's a certain kind of poverty in administrative ministry. It's not a poverty of money, though definitely many of us in ministry, our jobs push the boundary there also. But I think the greatest poverty that we experience is oftentimes the poverty of measurable results, a poverty of visible outcomes. And a pastor, when I was a field ed student myself, I remember one time he took me out onto the front porch, and he just wanted me to look with him at the wheelchair ramp that had been constructed leading into the parish center. And he said, "Ann, you just have no idea the amount of joy this gives me." He goes, "So much of my work is intangible. I never get to actually see the physical results of it. And just getting to see something physical," he goes, "I get why so many pastors want to build, new wings on, or new parish centers, or a new gym or something like that, because so much of what we do, you never get to see something physical come from it." But I think over time, we've learned to trust that what we are doing really does make a difference. And ultimately, I think administration teaches us then to trust in God, to know that even if we don't see things happening, or sometimes begin to kind of lose hope in the system, that God is underneath it. One of the images I've thought about frequently is how did Jesus learn how to sleep in the middle of the storm? Because I've seen so many administrators at this point in time, when things are whirling around them, it can be really hard to even sleep and to really entrust things into the hands of God. But that over time we begin to recognize that God is taking care of things beyond what we're able to take care of things, and that there is a basic goodness to the world that still exists, that undergirds everything we do and makes it possible. A third characteristic of what administration gives to us, I think, is humility. This is the one that I referred to earlier. That administration definitely has moments where it makes us aware of how much that we've learned and grown in the ministry. Tasks that we used to find really hard, all of a sudden we realize, hey, this is pretty easy for me now. But those are not the only kinds of moments that we know that we have during our day. That just as often administration has moments that make us aware of our shortcomings and our limitations. And times when we're in the office and we sit in front of really good and holy and talented people and think, who am I to be giving them advice? I don't know the answer any more than they do. And there's times at important meetings, being asked questions that we don't know the answers to, or looking at financial reports we don't really understand, times when we lose our temper or miss a deadline or bypass a step in command. And then, we're supposed to write a performance evaluation for someone else. And you think, hello, Splinter, this is Plank speaking. Much of the work that I'm involved with right now has put me in collaboration with researchers from the Harvard Negotiation Project, which has done this outstanding work in analyzing difficult conversations and interpersonal challenges. And one of the things that they've noted about what makes performance evaluations and kind of giving feedback to other people so difficult is that these moments evoke within us an identity quake. Each of us, they observe, would like to think of ourselves as good, as competent, and as lovable. But moments like these, ones that I've described, throw one or more of those identities into quake. We find ourselves to be, it's giving us feedback that we're not as good or as competent or as lovable as we want to be. Brad Banau, who's a former pastor, and now he's the dean of a Lutheran seminary, wrote a paper a while back, which I found really intriguing. The title of it was something about shame in administration. And when I saw the title, I thought, oh, I've got to find that. He had done research saying that those who serve in administrative capacities oftentimes experience a heightened sense of shame. And he tried to figure out why that was. And one of the things that Banau noticed was, or drew a distinction, was between guilt and shame. Guilt being the feeling of what persons experience about actions that they've done or not done, and shame being the experience that persons have unattached to particular actions. So beyond not doing enough, shame is the feeling of not being enough. Beyond the sense of doing wrong, shame is that sense of being wrong. And shame, he says, is the result of the impotence to alter things. And that in administration, it comes from oftentimes having too much responsibility with too little power to actually affect a change. And because of that, shame has the potential to really paralyze people, making those who feel overwhelmed by tasks already even less able to deal with those tasks and even less effective then in their positions. So what I came to recognize, though, is that administration offers options between becoming defensive, like it's your fault that I've missed the deadline, or defenseless, which is I'm just not any good at my job whatsoever. I don't know why they've hired me. I think I should quit. Administration offers us the opportunity to really gather a more accurate and truthful picture of ourselves. It puts us in those kinds of situations that we would not confront otherwise. And it lets us see how we can handle certain kinds of demands and pressure. It's stressful enough that we can't manage to put on a good face week after week, month after month, without our true selves coming to the surface. We could try to hide our temper, our procrastination, our wishy-washiness, name your vice, for a while, but eventually the work of administration will bring it to the surface. And you'll know sides of yourself that you wish were not there, certainly sides that you wish other people did not know were there. And at that point, I think administration invites us to a second kind of gift, which is the opportunity to become comfortable with the true picture of yourself, because it turns out that none of us is as good or as competent or as lovable as we want to be. And if we don't expect ourselves to be perfect, we're less likely to be disappointed when we do something imperfect. One of the things Banau says in his article is that in the sacrament of baptism, we are asked to renounce Satan and all his empty promises. And Banal says one of the empty promises that we are called to renounce is the promise that somehow we can do everything without error, that somehow we can meet all the needs of all people all of the time. And if we know, for instance, that we're not totally competent in our job, then when other people present us with evidence of some incompetence, we can say, you know, you're right. It looks like I did that wrong. I'm still growing in my job. Thanks for pointing that out. So it's possible not to be a perfect administrator, but still be good enough administrator en route to becoming that better administrator. And that's what the Christian tradition calls humility. Humility does not mean putting oneself down or placing disproportionate focus on one's weaknesses. Humility is synonymous with honestly regarding oneself. It involves acknowledging the good and affirming moments of our day as well as those kind of challenging, quaking moments. It requires knowing our gifts and our strengths and our successes and knowing our weaknesses and our growing edges and being willing to present oneself in the most accurate public representation possible, aware that there might be even more yet that we have to learn. So I think that's one of the things administration can invite us to. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip a fourth one. There's so much we could talk about. And it's sad to me because some of the things I think I've mentioned have been some of the more difficult ones, and there's a lot of really positive things I think administration calls us to as well that are a little less frightening than the ones I've mentioned. But let me just close on this note, that each of the things I've been talking about so far and all the other things I talk about in the book are all ways of living Paschal mystery and embracing the mystery of death and resurrection in our life. Now, I know to say that administration invites us to embrace death can sound a little bit melodramatic because it's not like there's very few opportunities for martyrdom in our line of work. Except that one time my boss said to me, and I thought this so wise, in administration we die 1,000 deaths for the good of the whole. And a lot of the ways that we experience death as administrators are things that I've kind of alluded to earlier in this hour, death to the ego, death to control, and realizing we're never going to be able to really manage the chaos of that's our organization, death to productivity and not accomplishing all the things that we hope to get accomplished in the day. One of my key mentors in this role, she would say to me over and over again, "Anne, the ministry of administration is in the interruption." And if we've talked about so many of these things earlier in the hour, why do I bring them up again? Because I think for us as Christians, the image of death and resurrection is absolutely central to any discussion of Christian spirituality. For us, the mystery of faith is that Christ has died and Christ is risen. And that when we are baptized, we enter into that mystery of death and resurrection. We say we go into that water tomb and we come out on the other side. So that pattern, though, of baptism is just the beginning of that pattern in our life, that over and over again, we're going to go into death and into resurrection. So that every Christian vocation, if it's a true vocation, is going to bear the markings of the Paschal mystery. And that when we see those kind of markings on our life, far from being a sign that it's not one's call, that actually it could be a sign that you are on the right vocational path. Deborah Humphreys, who's a sister of charity, says someplace about vocation, "You did not choose this, it chose you. If you had refused, you'd have other regrets. Take your chances." I think for myself, just to kind of close with a story, we know that experience of death that we have in our administrative journey is never the last word, because as a Christian vocation, the call to administration is also always a call to hope, which is this kind of bizarre strength that we find within ourselves to keep striving for the good, even when it seems like it's impossible that it might be realized in a particular situation. And I realized for myself that at a low moment in my own administrative career, I had the opportunity to have breakfast with another academic administrator who I admire a great deal. And she's a generation older than me. She's made huge contributions to the field. And I've always been kind of like in awe of her strength, because she's been such a positive and active person in the church over years, even in some really difficult situations in her diocese. And when I looked at her, I always thought, well, if she can find meaning and energy in this work, then surely I can stay. But I really wanted her secret. And so this one time we were at a conference together, and we were having a stack of pancakes at breakfast, and I said, what is your great hope? You know, like, what is it that keeps you going in your role? And she said, well, knowing that there's a new generation like you that's out there who's finding energy in the ministry. And when I get really discouraged, I remember that you're there. And I could not decide whether to be very flattered or very, very alarmed, because if she kept going because I kept going, and I was going because she was going, this seemed to be a very perilous, fragile arrangement for the future of the church. You know, but then I realized that is probably the way that the ember of hope has always been fanned all the way throughout history. This is the spirit that's alive in the church still, and that sometimes you carry me in my role, and sometimes I carry you in your role, and that together we give each other the strength to keep doing what we need to do. So I'm going to stop there, Jared, and then if we want to let's go to some questions.
Yeah.
I know I've talked far too long.
Well, thank you, Ann. Yeah, I'm going to take back controls over to me. And,
okay.
And we can maybe try to restore the video. If you can turn your webcam back on, if you can.
I'll give it my best shot.
Give it a shot. Great. Okay, so now would be the time to ask questions. If anyone wants to submit them, we have about 5 more minutes left to do that. So find the question section of the GoToWebinar panel and go ahead and ask them. I have a few questions too that I've written down and that people are going to throw in as well. Let me pull the video up so that I can see you. Okay. One is just I'm just kind of curious about the difference between leadership and administration. I don't know if you can draw a distinction here about kind of the things that you're talking about when you talk about administration, the spirituality of being an administrator versus the spirituality of being a leader.
Yeah, and there have been a number of things that have been written about leadership.
Yeah.
And many times I would say that the two overlap significantly. It's really good if leaders have administrative skills, and it's really good if administrators have some leadership skills. But the kind of line I guess I might define is that I think of leaders as those who oftentimes provide the large vision for an organization and enable that vision to move forward. Oftentimes administrators are those who are charged with executing the vision and carrying out it. And somewhat similar to the parallel between like a CEO of an organization and the COO of an organization. Again, you hope that there's a lot of shared gift sets, but there's some that may not overlap. Leadership also, I think, can be exercised outside of an institution, and oftentimes administration really is exercised within institutions. I include in administration, in the book I define it as, in the Latin term, ad ministration, means the Latin really means toward ministry. So all those kinds of activities that allow for ministry to take place. The stuff I talked about in the early section about setting a context or a vision, an environment in which ministry can flourish.
I love that. I love that idea of administration, the way you describe it being such a service and focusing on the people you're serving, even if you can't see them. Um,
Yeah.
one person asks about, Greg asks about whether you consider administration a charism or not.
Uh, I do think so. I think that's how Paul would define it in 1 Corinthians. I mean, it's a gift set that's given for the sake of the service of the church.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's great. Amy is asking for a clarification on a quote. She says, I missed I missed whom you quoted in administration we die 1,000 deaths for the good of the whole. Do you remember?
That was the president of our or of our school. His name's Charlie Bouchard, and he's now the provincial for the Dominicans. And he was the one who said that to me, and he lived that every day. I mean, like, I feel very grateful that in my own beginnings in administration, I had some excellent administrators I was working under who modeled for me that kind of pouring out of self.
That's great. And I wrote down a whole bunch of great quotes, and thank you, especially for the last part about shame versus guilt. That's a great distinction there. I think thank you for drawing that out.
And that's Brad Banau. Mm-hmm.
So we have a couple other questions coming in here. Oscar says, in an administration role, in order not to die when you have been a leader, God usually adds life in a different form, correct?
I think that's true.
Yeah.
And one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about it, and I wanted to talk about it, but in the end of the book, I talk about discernment that one can do about whether or not God is calling me to something different other than this.
Yeah.
Because I really do think there is an important distinction between paschal suffering and what I'm going to call useless suffering. I don't think God just wants us to suffer without any purpose. And if we end up feeling like a heap of ash at the end of every single day, then I think God really is inviting us to do something different. So it's a question to me. Sometimes I think one of the most difficult things to discern as an administrator is the suffering that I'm going through right now really paschal suffering? It's transformative suffering that's better, it's making me into a better person and the church into a better place? Or is it time to get out? And I do think there's a real distinction that needs to be made there too.
And one thing you said in the end of your book, Redeeming Administration, you said something about prayer, and somebody had told you to be careful what you pray for in this context, and that sounds very similar to what you're saying, right? Can you maybe explain what you meant by be careful what you pray for?
It was one of my own supervisors said that to me one time. He said, Anne, you say you want to become a more patient person. You're going to pray for patience. The only way that you're ever going to become more patient is, like, how would God allow that to happen? Is God would put you in situations where you would be required to practice the virtue of patience over and over and over again. And so that makes me, I was like, oh, I got to be really careful what I pray for, because obviously that's what will come down the pike. So at the end of the book, I say the only thing I pray for at this point is, God, whatever you will, it's fine. I know that's what's the best thing in the long haul. If you could just be gentle, I would really appreciate that.
That's great. Kathy would like a little clarification. She said regarding guilt and shame, she wasn't quite sure what shame was, and maybe could you say again what that distinction is?
Sure. And this is a distinction that's made by Banau. It's not something that I was able to come up with myself. He talks about guilt as being associated with particular actions that you do or that you don't do. But shame is not associated with any particular action. So rather than the idea of doing wrong, like I've done something wrong, it's the experience of being wrong, which is kind of this persistent cloud that hangs over a person where I'm not the right person, which is a much more difficult thing, I think, to feel than guilt. And that we are invited, I think, by our sin to feel guilt on occasion. We should feel like, boy, I really screwed that up, and I'm sorry about it. But we're not ever asked to feel shame, which is a sense that you yourself are not enough, that you are not good. Not that just your action was not good, but that you are not good.
Good, thank you. I'm just kind of curious about a piece of advice you hear a lot from people about follow your passion and do what you love, follow your passion, but it seems like that's kind of in I don't know if opposition to kind of the things you're saying about spirituality, but what would you say to somebody who says, as a piece of advice, the way to find your calling is to follow your passion? Because I feel maybe the administration isn't necessarily always that passionate thing if you're constantly, answering emails, etc. So what would you say to somebody who's that piece of advice?
I really do like Frederick Buechner's
Yeah,
definition of
yeah,
vocation, and where he says that your vocation is where your own deepest joy meets the world's deepest need. I think what happens, though, is that in pursuing your passion, it inevitably happens that you encounter suffering. So it doesn't mean like going off of your passion, but I do have a real passion for order. I do have a real passion for teaching. I have a real passion for ministry and theological education. And it just so happens that in pursuing that passion, there's a lot of frustrating stuff that comes along with it. And in part, it's frustrating because I am so passionate about it. If I weren't passionate around it, I wouldn't care that much. I'd just go home at the end of the day and not think about it. So I think a lot of the frustration that administrators do experience is because they have so much passion about the reign of God and what they want to see happen.
good.
If you don't have passion, then do get out of it.
Otherwise, it would be very difficult, I think, to push through
Yeah.
all of what you've said. So, and thank
Right.
you so much for your time today. And I really appreciate the advice you've given us and your gifts and the gifts that you've shared with us and your experiences as well. So thank you so much. A lot of people have been asking your name and where they can find out more about you or find out more about what you do, and the name of the book, which I'll show the name of the book here in just a minute again.
Please.
And where can they, if they want to find out more about your work?
Yeah, by all means, email me. I'm happy to talk with people by email.
Sure.
I'm at garrido@ai.edu. If you Google me, it'll come up. And then also, I do have an author Facebook page I started where I try to put some stuff about ministry that I'm doing up there, which is Ann Garrido D. Min, and I'd be happy to converse with people in that way too.
Good deal.
So, thanks.
Good deal.
Thanks,
Well,
Jared.
yeah, thank you. And this is the book. You can see the cover of the book that Anna shared, I think, 3 of the 12 spiritual habits. And with each habit, she has shared, and maybe you can talk more about it than I can, but you've shared a saint or somebody who goes very very well with those habits, right? The virtue.
Yeah, because when I went searching through Butler's Lives of the Saints, I was looking for like administrators. Is there any history of this as a holiness path in the church before? And so I found 12 people whose lives I became really quite enchanted with. I think were really interesting as a kind of a spiritual companion on the journey.
Well, thank you so much. So if you're interested in ordering, the book's called Redeeming Administration, the long subtitle, 12 Spiritual Habits for Catholic Leaders in Parishes, Schools, Religious Communities, and Other Institutions. If you use the promo code webinar 1015, which is today's date, 10/15, you can get 20% off if you order it at avemirpress.com. And that will be good until October 22nd, 2013, which is a week from today. So go ahead and write that down, and it'll also be included in the follow-up email that we send out later this week. So before we sign off, I just want to say thank you again to our partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priests Councils for their partnership in the series. If you're not familiar with their organizations, you can see their websites displayed here. Feel free to connect with Ave Maria Press on the various social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Vimeo, where these videos will be posted. The recording of this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be placed at or on Vimeo.com and YouTube.com. But especially you can find this webinar recording and all of our webinar recordings going back to for the last 3 years or so at avemariapress.com/webinar-videos. And finally, if you want to join us next Tuesday for our next webinar in the series on October 22nd, 2013 at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, authors of a new book called Just Married, Dr. Greg and Lisa Popchak, will share their tips on marketing Catholic marriage in a post-marriage world. So mark your calendars, and we'll see you again next Tuesday. Again, and thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks, everybody.